See you on a God. Hello, all. Oshta afternoon. Good afternoon, Awado. Thank you for watching. So this is day 12 of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell. I hope y'all are learning a lot because I know I sure am. Okay, let's see here. Just as great conquerors like the Mongols, Mongols, or the Spaniards disdained commerce as beneath them, so ordinary people in slave societies disdained many kinds of work because it had been done by slaves. I can see that even now. Like, who's picking the crops? You know what I'm saying? They're like, I'm not gonna do that. I'm not gonna do that, especially for those wages or whatever, right? Anyway, they don't pay me enough for that. There's other forms of jobs or whatever that people think are beneath them. And I'm gonna tell you, that's pride and ego right there. Because if you need a job, scrubbing toilets cannot be beneath you. Like, I mean, come on, right? Anyway, one consequence of this was that immigrants with a work ethic, such as Italian immigrants to Brazil and Argentina, who often entered such societies, much poorer than the existing white populations of these countries, began at the bottom by working at many tasks that local whites disdained, and ultimately rose to a higher economic plane than the whites who had been born there. And that's the thing too, is if you've never had to actually like go and do a job that you thought was menial or whatever, then I'm happy for you, because I would pray that you would never ever be put in a position to where you would have to do something that you would never think of doing. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know. Anyway. Okay. That many whites disdained who had been born, and ultimately rose to a higher economic plane than the whites who had been born there. Oh, dang. Yeah, I could see that. Starting off at the bottom of the totem pole, so to speak, and then just bypassing because they're like, we're not too good for this stuff. We're going to do it. We have an end goal in mind. I think that's the best thing, is to always keep your dream in the forefront so that you are always pushing toward it, you know? Whatever their initial disadvantages, the immigrants were not burdened with the native-born whites' aversions to work. Former slaves and the descendants of slaves likewise developed aversions to tasks performed under slavery. In the British West Indies, for example, blacks after emancipation left the plantations in such numbers that a whole new plantation workforce had to be imported from India to replace them. The economic cost of such attitudes, deriving from slavery and continuing for generations thereafter, cannot be quantified, but also cannot be dismissed as negligible. Where slaves and slave owners have been of visibly different races, then the racial animosities and distrust deriving from the era of slavery may also last for many generations. Did I skip a page? No, I did not. For many generations after slavery itself is over, leading to economic and psychic costs to individuals as well as social costs to nations. Although the negative economic consequences of slavery, including consequences among generations born long after slavery itself was ended, cannot be quantified, the patterns of lasting economic lags in regions where slavery was widespread may nevertheless be suggestive. In the United States, and no doubt some other societies, one of the major psychological legacies of slavery has been a sense of shame and resentment among the black population and a sense of guilt among the white population. Of course, the reiterated depiction of enslavement as a peculiarly black experience falsely makes this seem to be a uniquely shameful fate to which a particular race submitted, requiring for some of their descendants oh my gosh, he's bringing it up. Okay. Ooh, he's gonna talk about reparations, y'all. Anyway, like, Thomas Sowell is just like stepping all in it, right? Me, I'm like, I don't want to step in that elephant poop, right? He's like, I'm swimming in it. Like, let's go. Anyways, excuse me. Got a little cold or something going on. I don't know. I thought it was allergies, but hey. Let's see. Okay. The reiterated depiction of the enslavement as a peculiarly, sorry, peculiarly black experience falsely makes this seem to be a uniquely shameful fate to which a particular race submitted, requiring for some of their descendants compensatory bombast from themselves, and if possible, compensatory benefits to be extracted from others. To whites, the false depiction of the history of slavery makes some feel uniquely guilty and responsible for the current misfortunes of blacks. And man, I'm going to tell you that guilt has got to be heavy. I would never want to be in that position. White guilt. Just knock it off. Seriously. Such attitudes and the many cross currents they generate are hardly the framework for a rational discussion or resolution of today's social issues. The physical and psychic sufferings of slaves in the past are neither necessary nor sufficient to explain the economic and other differences between their present-day descendants and members of the general population. Exactly. Quit blaming all of that. You know what I mean? They're just deferring, deflecting the blame. The economic and other disparities between Europeans and Africans living, I could understand if their parents were slaves, but they weren't. We are far removed from slavery. How long are you going to keep on blaming it? It's like blaming someone in your household for you not doing what it is that you're supposed to be doing. Come on, right? Oh yeah, that person, they distracted me and I just didn't leave for work on time. You know what I mean? Or fill in the blank, right? The economic and other disparities between Europeans and Africans living, respectively, in Europe and Africa are vastly greater than the disparities between the descendants of Europeans and Africans living in the United States. Exactly. The latter have not lost but gained economically from living in the United States. Yes. That these gains derive from the tragic fate of their ancestors does not make them any less gains over and above where these descendants would be today if their ancestors had been left alone in peace in their homeland. This cannot morally justify the seizing of their ancestors. It simply affects the cause and effect question of the reasons for black-white disparities today. Often the economic lags or social pathology of American blacks have been blamed on a quote-unquote legacy of slavery. Whether it is the death, it's not death, it's dearth, D-E-A-R-T-H, of marriages and families among contemporary blacks, or their lower labor force participation than whites, or their high crime rates. Slavery has often been invoked as an explanation. Yes, it has. Yet the fact is that in the late 19th century, when blacks were just one generation out of slavery, okay? There was nothing like today's levels of unwed births or failure to participate in the labor force. It has been from the 1960s onward that these social pathologies have escalated. Whatever the cause, it has arisen long after slavery had ended. Two very different questions have been confused as regards the history of black families. Number one, why marriage rates differ between blacks and whites? And number two, why marriage rates among blacks are much lower now than in the past. Official census data show that blacks had slightly higher marriage rates than whites for every census from 1890 to 1940. Did you know that? Because I did not know that. But far lower marriage rates than whites by 1960. On the black-white difference, some have argued that the census data from the late 19th and earliest centuries are misleading, that black unmarried women with children in that era called themselves widows to avoid the embarrassment of being unwed mothers. I've never heard that before, even though the mortality rate among black men was not enough to account for so many widows. Interestingly enough, those who argued this way offered no explanation for the high rate of marriage among black men during that same era. Oh yeah. Since unmarried fathers were unlikely to have children living with them to require them to pretend to be married when they were not. As of 1940, for example, from 66 to 70% of non-white males in age brackets from 30 and up reported themselves in the census as married and living with a spouse, adding those black males who were widowers, separated, or divorced, more than 3/4 of black males had been married, despite being only the third generation after slavery. Third generation. More than 3/4. Wow. However, one resolves the question of the black-white differences in rates of married and unwed motherhood. The more fundamental question as regards the quote-unquote legacy of slavery argument is why black marriage rates began a precipitous decline in 1960, nearly a century after the end of slavery, while the percentage of the first births that were premarital has long differed as between blacks and whites as it differed between antebellum two sticking together, antebellum Southerners and white Northerners, and between other groups around the world in places where slavery cannot be invoked as an explanation. The sharp increase in premarital first births among blacks began in the 1960s. From 1930 to 1934, 31% of first blacks to black births to black women, jeepers, 31% of first births to black women were premarital, while from 1990 to 1994, 77% were. Moreover, whereas in 1930 to 1934, premarital births plus the births of children conceived before marriage but born after marriage were altogether still a minority of all black births. By 1994, these two categories constituted 86% of all black births. That such a quote-unquote legacy of slavery would take nearly a century to appear strains credulity, credulity, summary and implications. The history of slavery can be looked at from several perspectives or for several purposes. Whether slavery is examined morally, casually, or politically is a matter of individual choice. But once that choice is made, accuracy and consistency are crucial, absolutely. Moral judgments must be made with the facts as they are or were, and applied consistently regardless of the race, exactly, nationality, or religion of either the enslavers or the enslaved. These facts include the social context and the constraints and consequences implied by the context. We cannot assume 21st century options or even present day knowledge when judging decisions made in the 19th century, exactly. Nor can we assume that we have superior knowledge of the social realities of an earlier era that we never lived through, compared to the firsthand knowledge of those who confronted those realities daily and inescapably. Exactly. Moral questions about slavery have been almost exclusively Western moral questions. Non-Western societies, had neither moral concerns about slavery nor, in most cases, the power to decide on the continuance or extinction of the institution for themselves during the era of European imperialism. When slavery was suppressed over most of the world by the West, not only has the West's crucial role in the destruction of slavery around the world gone largely unnoticed, standards applied almost exclusively to the West, have been used to condemn European and European offshoot societies for having once had slavery. Even those Western leaders who sought to end slavery are condemned by critics today for not having done it sooner or faster. The dangers and constraints of their times have too often been either ignored or brushed aside as mere excuses, as if elected leaders operating under constitutional law could simply decree whatever they felt was right. Exactly. Even a sympathetic biography of George Washington, for example, said, in quotes, he had helped to create a new world, but had allowed it an infection that he feared would eventually destroy it, end quote. The statement is breathtaking in its assumptions. Washington did not, quote unquote, allow slavery, which existed on American soil and around the world before he was born, nor did he have the option to decree its end. Even to have made slavery a public issue at the time would have accomplished nothing except to jeopardize the survival of a fragile coalition of newly independent states. Yet this man, who contributed more than anyone else to the introduction of free republican government in the modern world, is widely seen as being under a moral cloud, as if he had chosen to introduce or abet slavery. Washington's actual behavior illustrated what Adam Smith had said decades later in his theory of moral sentiments, that a man prompted, end quotes, by humanity and benevolence, end quote, when he cannot establish the right, end quotes, will not disdain to ameliorate the wrong, end quote. Abraham Lincoln, who took advantage of a military conflict to stretch his powers as commander-in-chief to the point of issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, has been downgraded in the post-1960s world for not having done it sooner, more sweepingly, with more fervent moral rhetoric, and with affirmations of the equality of the races thrown in. The serious legal and political risks that Lincoln took when he emancipated Southern slaves are ignored. There was no groundswell of public opinion, even in the North, for freeing slaves. On the contrary, in a war-weary nation, it was feared that the Emancipation Proclamation would stiffen, S-T-I-F-F-E-N, Southern resistance and reduce the chances of an early negotiated settlement of a conflict that killed more Americans than any other war before or since. You know how they said that, like, so many of us died, and I mean us, I mean Americans, in Vietnam War, in Afghanistan. I'm not sure about Operation Enduring Freedom. That's the one I was a part of. But anyway, to think that more people died in the Civil War than any war, right, is just insane to me. Lincoln himself was unsure what the net military effect of the proclamation would be. Yet military necessity was the only rationale that had either a constitutional basis or a political chance of being accepted. Those in later times who judge only by words may be disappointed that Lincoln did not make a ringing moral case for emancipation, but seldom, if ever, do they ask whether that would have made the proclamation more likely or less likely to survive both constitutional and political challenges. Despite Lincoln's mastery of moral rhetoric, some consider his Gettysburg Address the finest speech in the English language. The Emancipation Proclamation was written in such dry and dull language that it has been likened to a bill of lading, L-A-D-I-N-G. But Lincoln understood that ringing rhetoric can be as counterproductive in some situations as it is inspiring in others. To have made the moral case for emancipation in the proclamation would have undermined its acceptance as a matter of military necessity. The earlier emancipation of slaves in the British Empire likewise invoked military necessity and avoided ringing humanitarian rhetoric in order to maximize the range of its political support. As a distinguished scholar aptly put it, in quotes, "We are so conditioned to expecting interest to masquerade as altruism that we may miss altruism when concealed beneath the cloak of interest," end quote. As it was, Lincoln was viciously attacked in the Democrats' press for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. Did you know that? Because they try to convince us that it was the Democrats that wanted to free everybody. I'm just saying. And then they tried to say that the parties switched. That never happened. Anyway, I'll read it again. As it was, Lincoln was viciously attacked in the Democrats' press for issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. Nor was this simply a question of his own political career being in jeopardy. Lincoln warned Andrew Johnson, in quote, "to remember that it cannot be known who is next to occupy the position I now hold, nor what he will do," end quote. At this critical moment in the history of the nation and of the fight against slavery, William Lloyd Garrison could indulge in ringing rhetoric without regard to the consequences, but Abraham Lincoln had the heavy responsibility of the consequences squarely on his shoulders as he faced his countrymen and history. Lincoln had been elected, and I believe the Emancipation Proclamation got him killed. Just seriously. Lincoln had been elected to his first term by a plurality rather than a majority. And it was by no means certain that he would be reelected, especially when the controversy over the Emancipation Proclamation, swirling around him. Exactly my point. Don't go hang, love you, mean it.